So hi everyone, my name is Corey Legasic. I'm here with you today from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. I'm a Dawson Humanities faculty and sociology teacher, Saltese Fellows, been with Saltese for a year and a half, and I'm also a new education PhD student at McGill. And I'm very excited that we've been working in a series of workshops today. This webinar is one of them to kind of continue a conversation around equity, diversity, inclusion in our teaching practices. And I'm getting to know Martha, and I'm excited to kind of introduce you to her. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Martha. Martha is an instructor at Carleton University, Department of Biology. Her PhD is in plant biology, specifically medicinal application of plant secondary metabolites, but she has had a passion for science education for a long time. This passion took her to a postdoctoral fellow with the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative at UBC, where she began her journey to explore evidence-based pedagogical practices and science education research. As a result of this work with the Carl Wyman Institute, Martha has developed a deep understanding of how to use innovative teaching practices, which she uses to design courses and activities to enhance undergraduate student learning. In addition, Martha has demonstrated a keen sense of community and contribution, which we're going to see today, and has supported and facilitated the implementation of these new instructional practices among her colleges, including promoting collaborations across faculties, participation in multidisciplinary research teams, support of training teaching assistants, and other forms of mentorship for undergraduate research projects, and including her ongoing commitment and participation with us here at Saltese. This fall, Martha was named the 2021 Carleton University Chair in Teaching Innovation in recognition of her years of dedication to encouraging new teaching practices and rethinking pedagogy in innovative ways within the STEM disciplines. And her commitment to improving the student experience doesn't stop there. In the last few months, she and colleagues have begun to develop this toolkit, this EDI toolkit, part of their efforts to address the need for more attention to issues of social justice and equity within STEM disciplines. We're super honored to have Martha join us today to talk about the toolkit. I don't know if you've had the chance to look at it yet, but we'll give you a tour and use it as a starting point. That's what I really like. It's like opening a door rather than, just the set of practices. It's opening and starting a conversation about how we increase student engagement through a greater sense of inclusion. So thank you for being a mentor with us today and all of your work, past, present, and future. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Selma, who's going to tell us a little bit how we're going to run today.
Thank you very much, Corey, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be here. So I think much like you and all of us around this webinar are advocates of student-centered learning. I think we all agree on at least on that. But who are these students in our classrooms? We teach students, not content, and sometimes we tend to confuse those variables. We have a responsibility to all our students who entrust us with their learning experience. And we, the teachers and the institutions, have to offer them not only safe spaces, but as someone mentioned in a previous webinar, brave spaces where they feel heard, seen, and represented. So I'm very grateful that Saltese is opening the space for this important discussion. And I'm genuinely and wholeheartedly excited about today's webinar. I told Liz and the Saltese group about how I absolutely fell in love with this toolkit, and I've been discussing it and sharing it with my colleagues in the hallways and through emails, unsolicited emails, sorry for those who got them. But that's how firmly I believe that this toolkit can be a great tool that bridges the research and theory on equity, diversity, and inclusion to the practical applications in the classroom. It's an easy document to follow. It's easy to pick and choose what we can implement in small doses or in larger doses. But it's truly a wonderful tool, and I'm excited that we're going to take a deeper look at it today. Even though it is called Science is for Everyone, I'm not a science teacher. I teach psychology, and I found it quite useful, and so have my colleagues in other disciplines. So I think what's in this toolkit is applicable to many disciplines. And I thank Martha and her team that came up with this. So without further ado, I'll pass the baton on to Martha, and then we'll follow it up with some Q&A and open discussions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Corey and Selma. Wow, such a beautiful set of introductions. I'm going to contact you later, Corey. I'm working on finishing my tenure package. I'm going to need all that text that you had. That's so nice, so nice. Such beautiful text. I want to meet that woman. I am so pleased to be with you this afternoon. Many of you might recognize me. I am a devoted member of Salties. I had the chance to meet Liz several years ago now, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and there's just been no looking back. And the inspiration for building community and building communities of practice has been so impactful in my own practice. I am really excited to talk to you about our toolkit. So I'll start my slides and we can get going. Oops, on my slideshow. Before I do that, I would like to just bring your attention, depending on your experience with Zoom or how much time you spend with Zoom. Lots of us are spending a lot of time with Zoom these days. There's a toolbar either at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen where if you want to, you can have a live transcript. So if it would be helpful for you to have some subtitles while I talk, I would recommend just go ahead and turn those on. And then most of the time you'll get a reasonably accurate transcription of what the person is saying. Not in all cases, but a lot of the time. So I have the pleasure this afternoon of introducing you to the toolkit that I am one of the co-authors of. And it was built at the Carleton University and specifically inside the Faculty of Science. Now, that said, I don't think, and I really appreciate Selma saying this already, but I don't think that the tools are sort of exclusively applicable in a STEM classroom. I really don't think that's true. But I guess I would argue, and I'd love to discuss more, that in STEM, issues of EDI have been ignored and invisible to us in lots of cases. And so sort of really focusing on STEM is valuable, I think. It's not the only valuable thing, but it's definitely a valuable contribution to make. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what motivated us to make this toolkit. The motivation really comes from one of my co-authors, Rowan Thompson. Rowan is the first person who's ever been appointed an assistant dean of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Faculty of Science. And that was quite recently, 2019. So prior to that, we didn't have this position. And so Rowan really brought a lot of vision to the role. We have had a series of talks on campus that we had never had before. But one of the things Rowan wanted to do was to think about action, right? Because that's the thing about these calls to equity, I think, is that we have to move beyond talk. We have to move to action. What does that action look like? And so she really focused in on teaching as a space of action for EDI. And those of you who have, I see some people like from the Faculty of Education, those kinds of people will know, right, that there's a long-standing discourse in education about education as a practice towards liberty. And so maybe for some of us, education is sort of inherently an act of social justice. That's personally my own philosophy of teaching in my classroom. And so we wanted to build a toolkit. That's why I have all these tools on my screen here, is just thinking about, like, you know, how could I use maybe this tool versus that, depending on the context. So we want to give our colleagues a set of tools, and we wanted to make it plug and play. We want to make it kind of like your iPad that like my 5-year-old can figure out, right? All of a sudden she's doing things on the iPad. And I'm like, what are you doing? My favorite time ever was the first time she saw a really big TV and she tried to move the pictures on the TV as if it was an eye. Just killed me. I was like apples inside their brains. We wanted to make it, frankly, so that our colleagues didn't have a lot of effort to start. We want to make it easy to get started. And so that's kind of our guiding philosophy. How can we make it plug and play? We also, Rowan and I, worked with this remarkable young person, Candice Harris. She was a student who worked on the project. And among the skills that Candice brought to the project was these beautiful images that I will show you all the way through our slides and all the way through the toolkit. These are images of our campus. So Candice drew pictures of Carleton, and Carleton's really pretty. Come and visit me anytime. And so one of the things is there's a train that goes through Carleton. There's certain buildings in the on campus that she has focused on. So we kind of took this idea of like a map through your experience. And I really appreciate what Corey said about opening the door, taking that first step. You know, how do we get started on this journey towards understanding EDI in our teaching? And so this is a micro map of our campus, but there's like key features of the campus. This is the building I work in, key little components of the campus. So for us, we recognize ourselves immediately in the beautiful images that Candice developed. One of the things that we presented to our colleagues is the EDI toolkit is not intended to make you an expert in EDI or in inclusive teaching. That's not the plan. Instead, it's designed to help people address EDI in their teaching design and their teaching delivery. It's designed to acknowledge the reality, which is that we have a diverse student body and we need to respond to that diversity. And we also want to design it so that we invite people into teaching in a way that includes as many people as possible. And that's the idea. So we had, in a couple of iterations, we presented this to the Faculty of Science board and asked them for feedback. And one of our colleagues, very rightly said, like, I'm not an expert on issues of LGBTQI and inclusivity. And I can't become that expert. And I said to him, no, we're not expecting you to become an expert in that. But let's acknowledge the fact that there are people in your room who belong to that community. And let's open ourselves up to what are some things that we can do to make the classroom more inclusive without you needing necessarily to become an expert. And that's, I think that's a challenge in the higher education space, right? A lot of us studied the thing that we teach. We studied it to become an expert about that thing. And now if you say to me, add these other new things to your course, but you're not really an expert in them, I might start to feel uncomfortable about that. And so the idea is to take these like pieces that you can add in without a need for expertise. So I'm going to walk you through the roadmap. So if we go, right, my computer doesn't want to go back. There we go. If we go back, we're going to talk about course outline ideas, course website, and then we move along to possibly things that you can do in your classroom, assignment ideas, in-class activities, and ongoing learning. And our idea is, start somewhere. And maybe you only start with some ideas to add to your course outline at the beginning. Just start there. Get started somehow, with some small parts. So the course outline, we have a lot of different things that we have added, and we've also always made it so that there's like links out to other resources. So for example, one of the things that we've all been talking about a lot in higher ed over the course of the pandemic is the state of the mental health of our students, right? And we need to be talking about that explicitly with our students, right? That your mental health matters. Your mental health is important. Your mental health is more important than your academics. The integrity of you matters so much. And so it's very small things like, here are the mental health resources from the university that you can include in your course outline. So that a student, when they're reading the course outline, that's one of the things that they'll see. The other thing that we've done is we've built a course syllabus that's annotated. So if you were looking at this, you would click here, and this is what it looks like. And what I want to point out, you can't read the text, I know that, but you can download your own version, which we'll talk about. But what I want to point out is that we don't have two things happening here. We have the syllabus itself sort of broadly laid out, but then we have all these yellow sticky notes there in the margins, and each of them explains something about that component of the syllabus. So Corey had mentioned to me earlier how he oh, maybe I'm not talking about this one. No, I'm talking about when you can meet with students, for example. So you might describe when you plan to meet with students, and then there's a description here about like why that's useful for students. Lots of us know that even if we have student hours or office hours, sometimes I say to my students, are the loneliest hours, right? This very lonely time sitting in my office alone. So, but sometimes maybe that's partly that maybe we don't communicate clearly enough to our students about what we intend with office hours. So there's an explanation here about filling out that explanation about what you intend and plan with your office hours. Over here around this assessment pieces of this course, there's some stickies that encourage the person to think about how can you distribute effort and practice through your course. This is a challenge for myself as a person trained in STEM, because the tradition is like 1 or 2 big assessments, right? Even though we know in terms of human learning, this distributed practice is a better way to learn. That's a way to support learning. So there's a descriptions of each of these components so that the person who wants to engage with the syllabus gets kind of a 2 for 1, which is they get a syllabus they can cut and paste, but they also get a little bit of sneaky pedagogical insight into these pieces of the syllabus that will help them think about their practice in other ways. We also have content that a person can cut, paste, and adapt. So among those things would be, again, mental health resources, my name badge pronunciation assistance for pronouncing your name, something that I use because my last name is a mouthful. Or the other thing we've been doing is developing a template course site inside our learning management system. So at Carleton, we're using Brightspace or Desire to Learn. And again, setting things up so that a person could take the whole thing and then edit it and make some changes for themselves, but not have to start from scratch, right? So that some of that stuff you could just like the iPad, you plug it in, oh, it's already going. And you can make some changes to it if you want to. We are encouraging, again, actions that are easy to implement. So here's a very small example. Something like using non-gendered terms when speaking to your students. You know, sometimes people may, and I definitely used to do this, stand in front of the room and say, okay, guys, we're gonna start class now, that kind of approach, right? Instead, maybe using words like friends or folks or everybody, or when you're referring to a person, not referring to aspects of their physical identity, but rather maybe their clothes that they're wearing, right? Like person with the blue hat, that kind of idea. That seems to me a very small action, right? But it's a small example that's easy to implement. And that's where we can just get people started with those baby steps in the direction of using these practices. We have lots of really cool assignment ideas, and I really encourage you to have a look at those and pull them out and use ones that will work for your class, make some changes to them. One of my favorite ones, that's hard to choose, but one of my favorite ones is probably a science hero, where my colleague, Rowan, she did this in physics, and she had students find a person, and the specific requirements were don't find one of the guys we already know, like Einstein, since she teaches physics. So find a person who has studied in this field and tell the class about that person. Maybe just do it in a writing or in a video or in a presentation. And she said that her experience was really powerful in terms of students getting a sense of the variety of humanity who has engaged with this topic instead of the small number of people who tend to be the majority who you might see in front of the classroom in our STEM classes. Yeah, it's another one. I really like the one about tell a friend, which is, and I've been taking this to heart in my biotech class, where I am teaching my students a lot about how COVID works and how COVID testing works and COVID vaccines, in part because I think that part of a science education should be that a person can talk to other people about how science works. So the tell a friend assignment is choose a topic and go and explain or talk to your friend about that topic. Pretty easy assignment, but an interesting one for a student to engage in, and then maybe write a reflection and some thoughts about what it was like to, how did you explain that to a person who's a non-content expert? How did you make it clear? What kind of questions do they ask you? It's a really interesting idea to, I think, open up the idea that talking about science with other people is really valuable and a good practice for us to engage in. And we have some lovely examples of in-class activities. And among the ones is understanding unconscious bias. I think you can have some really interesting discussions in your class about this. If you've had a chance, or if you haven't had a chance to have a look at the implicit association test, really interesting piece of work that's coming out of Harvard. I ran the test on myself. There's a bunch of different topics. And one of the topics that I looked at for myself was gender and science, where I discovered that I'm slightly biased against women in science. Imagine the impact of this on me. I found it very upsetting, but I also think it was really interesting for me to just think about the ways in which maybe I have internalized these external attitudes that I have been exposed to through my whole career, right? And becoming aware of some of those things so that you can get a chance to ask yourself, what are the ways in which those unconscious biases maybe are acting out in my life, or in my teaching or in my profession. Really interesting. It's a really short, there's a bunch of possible topics you can choose, but the whole thing takes you 5 or 7 minutes. Really interesting, and would make for a great conversational topic with your students, I think. So a very wise woman asked me several years ago about what about theory? This is a conversation I had with Liz that was so impactful in my life, because what she said to me, and those of you who know Liz well know how she combines practice and theory, right? She's so good at that. And so one of the things that we talked about is how practice needs theory. Practice without theory is it's ungrounded, right? But sometimes we're not ready for theory in our teaching practice, right? Sometimes it's a little too early in our practice. So one of the things that we've done is, rather than front load the theory in the toolkit, we have back loaded it. And so we've got sort of things to encourage bigger thinking, deeper thinking, reading about conceptual ideas about inclusivity, included in our ongoing learning. And we've included a wide variety of possible resources there. So shorter reads, longer reads, websites, videos, webinars, podcasts, all of those kind of diverse possible places, but places where if a person wants to dig deeper, then they will get a chance to get more exposure to the theory that will, I think, deepen their teaching practice. And so sort of my idea is that the tools and the theory ultimately can combine. And so in a lot of ways, right, this, I think, can help us build these reflective teaching practices that I think many of us are aiming to build. And so I wanted to give you one example, because I was thinking to myself, I did all this work this summer, and now can I think of an example of my own teaching practice? So I'm a plant biologist. I teach an introduction course, the second year introductory course to plants. It's like an anatomy course. So it's like body parts. And a big part of the course is reproduction, because you know how bodies got to reproduce. And reproduction is a really big part of biology, of course. And traditionally in plant biology, we talk about plants as being male and female. And in the last couple of years, I started to think to myself, like, is it necessary to talk about a plant as male or female? And then the reality is that plants have a wide variety of reproductive strategies, including plants that have both male and female, I'm going to use quotes there, reproductive parts on the same organism, or plants that just produce clonally. And so just this week, I encouraged myself to think about a new way to teach this topic to my course. And this is really just about changing some of the language, but I included, mostly to get their attention, a special video that's called A Note About Sex. And then I recorded a short little video where I invited them to think about how it's not accurate to kind of have these binary ways of thinking about sex when it comes to plants. And that, in fact, and the biologists in the room will know, really what we're interested in is like cells that can move around and cells that are stuck in one place, and how those cells get together to result in more plants into the future, to make seeds, make fruits, and make other plants. And so this for me was an example, right, where I had a chance to really link my own teaching practice with this strong EDI content that's now become part of so much of what I'm doing in my professional life, and had a chance to really challenge myself in terms of, like, if you really believe this, Martha, how do you respond? And to be totally honest with you, what this means for my teaching is I made a 4-minute video explaining my thinking. So pretty low bar on the effort. And then I've changed some of the words that I use. So rather than talk about male and female plants, I talk about plants that produce mobile reproductive structures and plants that produce immobile reproductive structures. But so to me, I think this is what's interesting about some of this stuff, is that it's an invitation to start thinking in some new ways, to challenge these pre-existing ideas that we might have. That's part of it. And to find ways to teach that open the room up and recognize the diversity of lived experiences in the room. And I think it's really powerful and really important work for us to be doing. And so it becomes then embedded into our acting out and living a reflective teaching practice. So I'm going to wrap up there. I would love for you to get your hands on the toolkit. Thank you, Sue. She's popping into the chat for everybody. You can also go to our website, which is science.carleton.ca/about/EDI/E toolkit. It was written and compiled by Rowan Thompson, Candice Harris, and myself. It was supported by the Carleton's Faculty of Science, the Carleton faculty and staff, and friends and family. And we would like to gratefully acknowledge that all of the work was carried out on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Thank you so much. I look forward to having our conversation this afternoon.
Thanks so much. I just want to point out for our team that the PDF that we're putting into the chat, the links are not working within the PDF. So I'm wondering if we can link put a link to the website.
Definitely, I'll do that right now.
And what we were thinking at this stage, because it'd be exciting if it became morphed into a conversation or a sharing. But Selma and myself, who've have been both teaching, have been talking to each other about these questions here at Dawson in our own classrooms, supporting each other as we think of ways of kind of constantly pushing our own pedagogy. We wanted to kind of look through and start the ball rolling by kind of sharing some examples, like when we read through the toolkit, some of the things that we connect with individually in ways that we try to practice some of the ideas and principles from the toolkit, and also ways that the toolkit invites us to kind of try new things. And we're hoping that as we're bouncing back and forth, that in the chat, or just through, maybe if you want to raise your hand and jump in and ask a question, or share something with the rest of the group, that's how we're going to move forward. And then we'll actually have a question answer period more formally towards the end of the session. So we'll start that off. And I don't know if I can start off by just saying, there's a difference between performing, these kinds of, and I think you've said this, you keep saying this is about starting a discussion with ourselves, with each other as teachers, with our students. And it's not about doing these little things and performing, like being a woke teacher in the classroom, that it's about, yeah. And because it's something that I feel sometimes I've done things, I'm like, ooh, have I really sat to think about why I'm doing this? But one of them I wanted to start with is the how incredibly powerful and important it is for students to share their names. And I know for myself and for other teachers, there's that moment of going through your attendance list and being unsure about names, and also being unsure about pronouns, and how do I get this community started in my classroom. And one thing that I started doing a couple of years ago, and I use Moodle. So we all use different learning management softwares, but I use Moodle, and something that was a bit of a game changer for myself was asking students, and I'll actually quickly screen share this. Hold on. I just want to show you this is a screenshot from part of my Moodle. Selma, can you see?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just pointing you. It's very simple, but at the beginning of the semester, there's kind of two things happening here. So I always invite my students before our first class, or maybe after my first class, because I think it's helpful if they meet us, see the space, and kind of understand where this is coming from. But there's a tool in Moodle called Poodle, or there are other ways of doing this, but basically students can actually record themselves. So when they submit assignments, we'll come to this too, trying to open up different modes of expression, like really encouraging students and asking, why do I always need students to write stuff down? Is there an opportunity that I can invite them to talk to me as opposed to write to me? And so I've been trying to really explore using Poodle as an option where students, if I'm asking them to answer questions or reflect on something, that they have the option of recording themselves speaking to me, or they could do a written submission. But so what I'm doing here is at the beginning of the semester, I tell my students that I really want to honor the names, their names, and it's an important part of me feeling connected in the classroom, that I make an effort to learn their names. And what I do is I ask them to use the Poodle to introduce themselves, to say their name slowly. And instead of rehearsing a name, and I said, in front of the class, I actually have as a resource at home that I can go and listen to all students' names and hear them say their own names. So it enables me to kind of, if there are students' names that are less familiar to me because of language, or I'm not sure phonetically how to say it, or even in the context of Quebec, I'm like, I don't know if they're a Mary or a Marie, like it could be as simple as that. Giving them the opportunity to record themselves introducing themselves, and I have something to go back to and hear them say their own names and practice it on my own. And then the other thing I love about it is then I also get to individually quickly record a message back to them and say, hey, it's nice to meet you, and I say their name, and please, I hope you get in touch with me if you have any questions or concerns as the semester goes on. So there's that connection. But the other element of it is that I'm rehearsing in a very low stakes way. We'll talk about this later, about the zero assignment or the zero test, but I'm rehearsing a functionality of the Moodle page by asking them to record their names, and just saying their names. They are then prepared later on to consider the option of recording themselves again in delivering an assignment as opposed to writing through assignments. So that was, I see a lot of things in that, but I want to say that it's a small gesture that for me is very political. I think of students whose names are long or I'm not used to saying, and it's important that they don't give me a short form, which some students are used to doing, and that I honor their full name and that I take the time to learn how to say their full name. So that this is a really small gesture at the beginning of class that I think an effort that says something about how I want the rest of the class to work in terms of community. So yeah, I don't know if other people have strategies for names, or we talk about pronouns. I don't ask students to announce their pronouns. I feel uncomfortable putting students on the spot, but create opportunities where they can share, and I just use they pronouns until I know for sure if students prefer other pronouns. But Selma, I don't know if you want to throw the ball to you and you can pick up on that.
Yes. So I love what you're doing, Corey, and I think it's great. I think we can communicate our values to our students, or what we value to our students, in so many ways, and setting the tone from the beginning of the class is an important, it's a critical moment in the session, and you're doing it brilliantly, Corey. And I love also the suggestions that are proposed in the toolkit. Some suggestions for the course outline is a great way to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, as he said. I can't remember who said it, but I try to do something similar to you, but for someone who's so technologically inclined as myself, I'm still using pen and paper way of doing this. So I try to get students to write, or I write their names and try to phonetically write them phonetically so that I remember them. But one thing that's important to me as well is the using they until the for everybody as a general blanket until otherwise until told otherwise. And one of the things I noticed a few years ago that I do is I used to say, hey guys, hey, even though they're not guys. I teach psychology, and most of our students, usually in the first years, are predominantly not identified as guys. And this really hit home for me when I saw my daughter, who's now 4 years old, playing with her toys, and they're all dolls, and she's calling them guys, because that's how early on we internalize that kind of language. So I flipped this around, and I started just calling them humans, because that's the only thing we have in common, is to be humans. So that usually gets a chuckle out of students, but then they get used to it. I've tried to play certain games where I ask them to choose like how they want to be called for that week. So we have like a little name roulette, and you have the names that the students come up with. They suggest the names. So they want to be called unicorns one week. They want to be called crocodiles the other week. So I just make it a fun game, and it also creates that kind of cohesiveness and community spirit in the classroom. And we choose like randomly what name we're called for that week. And it may sound trivial, but I think it makes a difference in just putting everybody on the same footing, standardizing things, and not having to identify to pigeonhole people. So that's a little fun thing. Also, I like to come into my class and say, hello, unicorns. It just makes me happy. And I hope at least 2 other people. Another thing that I want to move from the further down the semester, from the beginning of the semester, when it comes to assessments and assignment. I think you hinted at it, Corey. The idea of propose the zero exam, the zero test or rehearsing as a way to infuse some inclusivity in our class and offer the students opportunities for low stakes learning, or opportunity for quote unquote failure. I try to do something very similar of very flexible grading. At the end of the semester, I ask the students to choose which grade they wish to drop. So I work it into this my complex system of grading. So it offers the students a chance to, revisit what their grades are and where they can sort of shift the values in their grades. And we can all understand that, 1 week we have we've had bad weeks. You come in and your assignment is not reflective, or your performance is not reflective of what your potential is. And I want to offer the students that kind of possibility to do their best and show their best and have a safety net in case that 1 week happens where things didn't go quite well. And I in the assignments, I also offer, much like you, Corey, Poodle as a possibility. I offer also oral presentations for students that prefer that option instead of a written exam, but with certain parameters. It's a case by case, but I'm still assessing their knowledge, but offering them many ways of expressing their what they know, and respecting their abilities, capacities, and cultural ways of learning. So I don't know if you want to add something to that, Corey. I know you have a few really neat examples.
Yeah.
Or anybody else.
Yeah, for sure. We're inviting people in the chat or to jump in, but we wanted to just kind of keep bouncing out some ideas. But I think that idea of rehearsing for me is really important, that like we often assume we don't see how these assessments, and we've talked about assessments in past webinars, are but sometimes are really loaded with a lot of kind of skills and assumptions about what people can and can't do and how people express themselves. And I think this idea of creating opportunities to rehearse the little skills that we're going to be asking them to do in larger assignments, but also by breaking it down, we kind of see opportunities to maybe offer a variety of modalities. Like we've already talked about, like recording oneself speaking as opposed to always writing things down. And coming a little bit back to the beginning of the course, because I'm such a strong believer in how we create the culture of our classroom, and that I think a lot of the things in the toolkit for me are striking in you're creating kind of norms of engagement in the classroom, which are built on respect and not always assuming you know everything that's happening in the classroom or what needs are. So there's creating the culture of the classroom, whether it's a safe or brave space, whatever, safe for space, so what language we use. And then I also like the language of building the container. And as a teacher, we have to kind of model early on that we have a set of skills that we're working on that are going to kind of hold the space and hold students to the best of our ability. And it's sending these little cues early on that we are creating a container, not just in terms of the pedagogy, but also in terms of the community. And I wanted to share a really lovely tool. I teach in social sciences and humanities, and I really do love taking the time with students to explore what it means to create a space. I love the expression learning to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We talk about learning edges, and the learning happens when we get to that place where we feel like we're outside of a box that is our comfort zone. And so how do we tell our students we're looking for those uncomfortable places, but I want the classroom to be a place where you can feel comfortable being uncomfortable? And one of the ways that I've been learning to do that, and I'm going to share this again, a lot of people do this in different ways, but this idea of creating kind of ground rules, or just talking about how to show up for each other if in difficult conversations that come up. And a group in Montreal put together this this tool that it's a safer spaces pamphlet. But what I actually have students do is I have students read through this either before class. I often kind of taken off guard. They're like, what does this have to do with the content of the class? But having them read through this pamphlet, and an active reading strategy here is I have them read through it, and it's listing all these different ways that you can step up or step back or stand beside someone in class, things that create a space where people are willing to be a little bit more vulnerable or considerate of each other. And so I have students go through this, and as an assignment, I have them identify one skill in this pamphlet, that they think they're going to be really good at. Something they're like, I'm good. I think this is something that I'm going to bring to the group. Like, this is a way that I am ready and able to kind of create a good space for people. And then to find one that they think is harder for themselves. Like for me, it's hard to talk less. It's harder for me to listen. Like, so when I see students in my class that I identify with, I'm like, you're someone who participates and engages by talking. And if you don't talk, your mind wanders. So you want to talk a lot. And so I say, instead of talking and stating things, why don't, for the second half of class today, all of your contributions should be questions of other people. Like, turn your engagement into asking other students questions, being curious about what people are saying. Anyway, so identifying a challenge, something that's going to be a challenge for me. Then I asked them to find something in this document that they need clarification on. And they're like, I want an example or a strategy of how to do this. And then I always, of course, invite them to see if there's anything missing that they would add to the pamphlet. So I always ask for those 4 things. And then I do like an in-class activity where I have them pair up or in small groups to share with each other. And then we kind of come back as a class. And just taking that time, it takes probably about, in a think, pair, share approach, I probably takes about 30 minutes. And it really feels like an investment, because it's something it gives us a language that we can come back to no matter what I'm teaching. If I'm standing and delivering on content and there's something, a dynamic or tension happening in the class, I have a language now that I can turn back to stop. I believe in pressing pause in class and just saying, okay, let's talk about what's happening right now. There's something that's distracting us or blocking us from being here together. And I think it's, whether it's emotions or attention, or you're worried about the test and I'm trying to talk about this. Yeah, so this is a tool I think of creating the culture of the classroom and building the container. I don't know if, yeah, so we're getting to 3:25. Yes.
Can you share the link to that? That looks really interesting.
Yes. Yeah, totally. I'll do that. We're at 3:25. We try to wrap up between 3:45 and towards 4. And we really want to make sure that this becomes a dialogue between people here. So we hope that we can start transitioning to questions from you and curiosities or things that you just want to throw on the table that you're struggling with. And we have a lot of people here in the room we know have lots of great ideas. Yeah. And I'm going to focus on getting the link for the safe pamphlet, but I haven't seen the chat if there are any questions or comments.
Well, I see a question from Karen. Thanks, Karen. I think these are really good points, and trust is a real thing, right? I think sometimes students learn not to trust their instructors because instructors might change the rules of the game partway through. So I think that's a really good point that you make about not wanting to do that. I'm trying to think if there's any good advice I have. So one thing I do is I have a set of assignments where sort of broadly, they're low stakes assignments. There's 5 of them. We can get the best 4 out of 5. But they all kind of address the same broad learning objective. So I find that helpful as a way to have those things get dropped. So maybe that would be one way for me to answer that. And I see, Selma, you've got some really good responses to that question too. I see, Manager, you have your hand up. Did you want to speak your question?
Hi, yes. Good afternoon. I'm Manije from John Abbott College. I teach nutrition. I'd like to share my own observation, and that is, I'm going to start with names. We have students from different backgrounds, and some students come from countries and communities that they don't have a last name. So the last name and new identity is provided for them. And I'm one of them, actually. I came in the 1980s, and Ali, I have no idea where that comes. But right now, my identity is Manije Ali, and I am kind of used to it. So it's an interesting observation. And sometimes you see students with long names. And I had one time kind of a chat with one of my students, and I saw a lot of first names, and I said, okay, tell me, what's the story here? What is your actual first name? And then he said that there was a bit of confusion how to formulate last names, so they ended up putting all the names in their family. So I think sometimes we are kind of not aware that names and identities for some of us or some of our students is it's a whole different dialogue to have, not just getting their name right, but actually what is that identity in a way. The other thing that I observe, I've been teaching since 1993, nutrition, and nutrition is a science of biochemistry. But I have been so much aware of this science in the context of North America, where I think it's a very kind of a practice that is exclusive. And I have been aware of it. So when it comes to pedagogy, I think it's very, very important to reinforce that nutrition as a science has a potential, and that potential is not just because we are preoccupied about certain issues here in North America. For example, the whole concept of healthy diet, the whole concept of dietary practices. People around the world survive for centuries with different types of diets. And some of our indigenous people, their diet is predominantly meat-based. And some places in North Africa, for example, their diet, the energy comes 50% from or so from dairy product. So I think one has to be very careful about interpreting nutrition data in a big, in a large kind of context in a way. And so I have been quite mindful about those things, and also the representative the samples, like certain criteria we have. For example, if I talk about body composition, where that criteria come from exactly, what are the sample sizes? So I think science has some issues of related to inclusivity, and one has to think about it. And the other area that I want to make sure that my students understand it is that when I present different type of knowledge, I want to make sure that this is derive from collective effort of humanity. So I have to tell them the stories of how vitamins discovered or minerals discovered or so on. So I think when we talk about EDI, we have to think about teaching in broader context, in pedagogy and pedagogical structure. And I think it would be a challenge for all of us to rethink, redefine our pedagogy in that context. So that's my observation, and I wanted to share with you guys. Thanks.
Thank you. One of the things I'm hearing, and I think it's really important for the STEM people in the room, is that some of us might have been trained to think of science as being really objective, right? Sometimes we tell each other even science is objective, it's a measure, it's quantitative, we measured it. Science exists inside a cultural context. And I think you were making some really good points about, and science values certain things over other things. It's really important that we think carefully about that. And for some of us, it means we have to go and learn the history of our own discipline. I think especially in my case, learning more about the multiple different ways in which genetics has been misused and misrepresented is an important piece for me to bring to the teaching of genetics. So for all of you who are objective scientists in the room, I really encourage you, to seek out a deeper understanding of the history of your discipline and bring that into your classroom, because we exist inside this cultural context that we sometimes pretend isn't true, and that's a misrepresentation. I really appreciate your point. We've got a nice question in here about Catherine. Yeah, talking about accessibility, really important. That's one thing I'd say even about our toolkit and about any of these conversations about equity and diversity and inclusion, like, whoa, the topic is so big. And Rowan and Candice and I decided to finish our project by September so we could give something to our colleagues this semester. But I would not consider it a completed document. And I think for all of us, learning more about accessibility, and it's a really good point, Catherine, about how sometimes whatever the accessibility surfaces are on our campuses, sometimes we don't hear from those people until partway through. In my case, sometimes I don't get those messages till the semester is like going to end in a week. And I think that could be where UDL is a set of tools to help us think about ways to make our content more accessible broadly. So I'm thinking about things like subtitles in videos. I'm thinking about things like text that can be interpreted by on-screen text readers. But I would say I still have a lot to learn about accessibility, and it's a really important point. Do you want to say anything about that, Selma, Corey?
Selma, you unmuted. Do you want to go?
Yes. Well, I just wrote in response in the email, offering multiple modalities to students, like the Poodle, like as you said, the subtext, even instructions in different formats. So, for example, I sent my students the instructions, the weekly instructions for assignments, but I also make a video that has subtitles that comes with the transcript so that it's available in many ways for students. So I think that's a way to sort of bridge that UDL EDI, but I think they're not mutually exclusive concepts, and we can only make our classroom richer by having those kinds of discussions conjointly. And I think some of the tools you propose in the toolkit, Marta, really begin that conversation. Catherine is some of you know, is the expert on this topic, so she might have more to say.
Yeah. Did you want to expand on that, Catherine?
Sure. Sorry, I was talking to somebody with a cat, so I seem to have cat ears. Sorry, this is
Love it.
my equivalent of bring your pet to class day. And of course, my pet will not walk onto my computer desk. So I get to, sorry, that's, so,
Love it.
okay. That was not intentional. I guess, I don't know about the rest of you, but I like to turn on live transcript and show subtitles as people are speaking. This is not captured unless one also wants a transcript, but this is terrific for students who asynchronously want to look at whatever it was that we were saying, or you were saying, or they were saying. One student with attention deficit issues said, it's really terrific. Sometimes I lose my concentration for a few moments, and this allows me to back up and look at it. But of course, it's also good for my student who never gets to class or falls asleep because he's a baker. And he gets off work at 5 and to turn up to my class at 2:30, he's not exactly in great shape. So asynchronous stuff, especially along with captions, can be really helpful. I can share in the chat if you like. Microsoft has really excellent techniques for how do we make Microsoft Word accessible, and they're small little tricks and easy to do. Same thing for PowerPoint. So some of these techniques are easy. The same is true for Adobe Acrobat that many of us use. How do you transfer something from Word to Adobe Acrobat makes a huge difference. If you have your Word file that is saved as, all your accessibility things are saved and go right over to Adobe Acrobat. If you print to Adobe Acrobat, this doesn't happen. If you make a course pack of, well, I've done it, antique articles that sometimes you highlighted, or sometimes you wrote little things in the margins, and sometimes 2 pages, not that they overlap, but you know, when the margin, when the back of the book broke, you kind of have half of one page and you know, maybe a bit of the other. These things are horrible for students who are using screen readers, and some of these things are so simple and so easy. So yeah, I've got loads of tricks. I've been working as a teacher for many years, too many probably to count, as Liz knows. But I also do research on students with disabilities. And in addition to my own students talking to me, the students that I do research on also talk. And they tell us some of the things that they need. So yeah, I would love to share some of this. I can do it some other day, but thank you for the suggestion.
Next
anyway, what I'd really like to see is that EDI includes everybody, including students with disabilities. You know, I'm very conscious, you know, by now when I do my questionnaires, I don't ask, are you male, female, check 1. I say, what is your gender? And let them write it in. And does it make stats difficult for, sure. But it's the way to go. And really the same is true for accessibility, as far as I'm concerned anyway.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think also too, a lot of us have experts on our campuses, like yourself, Catherine, like the people in my case at the Teaching and Learning Services at Carleton. And I think sometimes, right, we can get quite siloed from each other. And I think my only job is to think about biology, when really, as Selma so nicely put, right, I don't teach biology, I teach humans who hopefully will start to find biology interesting. And accessing that additional expertise that's on our campuses, especially around accessibility. For myself, I'd say this past semester, I've had a chance to do that, and it's been really, I've learned so much from my colleague in Teaching and Learning Services. It's a really, really good thing to do.
And I want to bring up, because I think it's been implied, but I don't know that we've said it yet, because we also don't want to just take for granted that, you know, EDI is the yellow brick road that you just get on and it's going to take you to, you know, the place with all your wishes come true. But it's like there's a lot of contention around EDI as well. And I think something that we need to really think about. And I think is, you know, Catherine, what you're talking about, and this idea that none of this makes any of us an expert. And in fact, we're doing harm if we start to use these tools in a way that position us as experts instead of just like conversation starters and praxis. But is that whenever we think of inclusion, we always have to ask, what are we trying to include students into, right? So even when we're talking about the, you know, the classes and objective science, that, you know, trying to engage more students into what? A discipline that is not examining itself, where we're not looking at the biases that are in our classrooms and our teaching practices, and we're just trying to get more students engaged in something that is already full of these kind of biases that, you know, exclude them, right? And a quick story I have is, you know, teaching a class about, and we're talking about racial profiling, and I actually had an older, mature student who's taking classes with me at night, but worked in HR at an engineering firm. And she said, you know, on one hand, I walk through the Dawson hallways and I see these inclusive banners where, you know, the programs are trying to enlist students from, you know, all over to kind of join up in these programs. But I work in HR, and I can tell you that we have policies in place right now that if you have backgrounds from certain countries, our firms will not hire you, right? And there's we need to see that reality and not set our students up for going into, by having an inclusive classroom, you know, setting our students up to go into disciplines and fields where they're not equipped and ready for the kind of harm and the realities that our disciplines are still contending with, right? And so I think, yeah, it's like the inclusion is a nice word, but we also we have the responsibility as gatekeepers of our disciplines to say, what are we trying to include students in?
Yes,
and I think, yeah.
A good point, Corey, and it's nicely made. That's a really big challenge. And I think that part of the challenge actually is responded to by, and I can only speak about my experience in my discipline, right, is in part by increasing the diversity of the discipline, even though, yeah, I want to invite people into a place that is maybe not reflective enough and not self-examining enough, right? But there are more and more voices that are saying we need to examine our practices, we need to examine our culture. So I think the combination of those voices and then an increasing diversity of members of that community can help to start shifting that culture. But you're absolutely right. I hate to think I'm inviting people into a toxic culture, but there might be a component of that. That's true. Liz had a question that she is wondering about coming back to, about using the inherent bias tool and how you might use it in your classroom to think about biases. So I would say this one, I think this is a really interesting one. So you can do a self-assessment. So I think the way that you could use this in your classes would be sort of a combination of things. So let's say in my classes, I might invite people to do the self-assessment bias tool before class. So do it before they come. And maybe specifically to look at the gender and science piece. And then have a conversation with them, probably in small groups, and probably to like just promote reflection about like, what did you find out about yourself? What are you surprised by? It's interesting in, oh, absolutely, among our colleagues, Liz, absolutely. I don't know if people have seen this movie. I think it's now on Netflix, called Picture a Scientist. Has anybody seen that? Oh, we should go. Well, if you're in the STEM discipline, you should go and watch it, but bring your tissues. It's specifically about gender and science, and there's a really important discourse and critique about how, let's say, for example, in the course of my career, there's been a lot of discussion about the importance of increasing women in science. We've got to get more people, we got to get more women to come into science. And that discourse has sort of to your point, Corey, has not expanded to, is it just women that we want? And so what has happened is that kind of diversity in science has become partly a conversation about white women in science. And so like a measure of diversity in science would be, well, we've got more women, therefore we're more diverse, which clearly is not a full response to the challenge of increasing diversity in your community. And so I think there's more critical discourse now about the importance of us expanding that idea about diversity. But at the same time, the reality is that many women in the STEM disciplines have experienced, they have trained in structurally sexist organizations, and they have joined a sexist culture as members of that community. And this movie, Picture of Scientists, oh, thank you, Corey. Look at you fast typing and finding things. It's really powerful because it looks at the experience of 3 different women through their careers and the barriers, the sexism, in one case, the like terrible sexual harassment that they experience through the course of their careers, and that this continues to be a reality in the discipline. So it doesn't, adding more women to the discipline doesn't solve the problem that the culture continues to be sexist. We have to get we have to open up the conversation bigger than that. But if you're a member of the STEM community, my friends, I really recommend watching that movie. It's very powerful, really impactful.
One thing that makes me think of too, I don't see any hands up, the implicit bias, and it makes me think of another aspect of the toolkit is, and I can't remember how it was worded, so maybe you could fast track me here, but this idea of as teachers talking about our own, I don't know, quote unquote failures, or like talking about ourselves, and there's a time and place for it. But I think in this case, it's interesting to do the implicit bias test and also share that with students, right? And for me as a teacher too, and as a broader strategy, sometimes I was lucky that I went through the CIGEP system, so I can actually pull out, because I'm organized in that way, I can pull out things that I've written in CIGEP a long time ago, and I will bring it to class and show them that I was not born a teacher and I wasn't born a writer, that I have very introductions introductions to essays as well that I'm embarrassed of. And so just being able to kind of, talk about our own experiences within our fields, our own experiences as students, our own mistakes that we've made where we're too quick to pass on information without checking it, or that we didn't properly cite something, or feeling like just a lot of these ways where we can kind of share stories of access for ourselves as well.
I really like that example. I'd like to hear other people though. My experience is that there's a gendered component to be able to do that safely.
It's true, totally.
And so I wouldn't do that.
Okay.
I would in a private conversation, but not in front of
a class, yeah.
Because my authority as a woman
Mm-hmm.
is always a little bit in question. and that's my experience teaching.
Yeah.
I see Jackie Farrell has shared that McGill is holding a panel discussion on Picture a Scientist, the movie. This is, oh my gosh, that's awesome. Jackie, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for today. This has been wonderful. So Picture a Scientist, as you described, is available on Netflix now, as well as through other platforms. And next week on the 17th from 1 to 2, the Faculty of Science will be holding a panel discussion to talk about the issues, and it's going to be with Audrey Moores, who is a prof in chemistry. It's going to be with Jessica Ford, who is a PhD student at the Redpath Museum in biology. And it's going to be with Mary Rose Bradley Gill, who is a grad from McGill, who did her PhD in biology and works for NSERC now. So I've put the link in the chat if you'd like to join us. Again, it's on the 17th. I think that's Wednesday from 1 to 2. And you just have to register, and you can check out the film on your own time on Netflix. Thanks.
Thank you. That's interesting. We have had a conversation at our campus about hosting something similar. And one of my colleagues said, she said, I think it's a great idea, and I don't want to be a panelist because it's too emotional for me. And I thought that was really interesting. I wonder how other women in STEM would respond to that.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Martha. And I do want to also kind of give a bit of a content warning to anyone who is going to watch the film, because the language alone that's used, like within the first 5 minutes, was, as a woman, a punch to the gut for me. So yeah, fair warning that it's heavy. There is some hope in there, obviously, but yeah, just a warning that if you're going to watch the film, a lot of people find it very, very emotional, their reactions. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Jackie.
So we're in our last 10 minutes, and I'm also doing that Zoom thing where I'm trying to enjoy and catch up on some of the conversations and resources that are going through. But Liz, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, first off, just thank you all, because this is an amazing presentation, and the content is so rich that we could keep on going for a very long time. What I'm thinking that I'm really liking about some of the recent chat that's evolving, and the comments that Martha, you made, and I'm hearing you echo, Jackie, as well as what's in the chat, is it's not. I think maybe inclusion and issues like we're discussing today are not just about our students. It's probably about us too, and maybe we haven't paid any attention to that, because the idea that we all hold these biases, and if this is for us to start having a conversation, we all hold biases, and some of those biases are actually against ourselves. And we have to recognize that, and that's been a long time notion within a Black community. We know that, sometimes we are the worst at, by being biased against ourselves, others like ourselves, I should say. But it's an important conversation that we need to open up and ask ourselves, how can we make how can we be more gentle to ourselves and gentle to our flaws, and more inclusive of how do we change these structural cultural images we have of ourselves and of each other as colleagues. And and hopefully that also is an important conversation that we can develop as we change how we include our students in a more mindful way.
It's a really good point, Liz, right? Because I think we live in a society where there's certain kinds of messages. And so I think people can internalize these messages. And so you have internalized racism and internalized sexism. And one of the things that's really powerful, I think, about this EDI practice, and as Corey was saying, as a practice and not as a performance, is internalized ableism. Absolutely, Catherine, thank you. Is that it helps us to reflect on that and maybe find and notice that in ourselves, and then be thinking about, maybe the ways in which we're projecting that onto our students. And the pandemic has revealed to us, right, that our students they continue to struggle. The situation in my institution is that big classes are all online. I'm still teaching online. So yesterday I had an encounter with a student in crisis, and I had to look up on the class list to find what that student looks like, because I've never seen that person's face before, right? So how, just to feel that distance between ourselves and our students, between ourselves and our colleagues, and we have to bring it even more empathy to each other and to ourselves right now, because we are survivors of a global pandemic, and the stress of the sort of constant stress that we've been experiencing for almost 2 years has an impact on us and changes our ability to tolerate other stressful stimuli. Kareem, did you want to jump in and share some ideas?
I did, because you just brought something to mind that I'm not sure how many people have recognized that our students are going through, but it happened to me just a couple of weeks ago. And a student came up to me in this term, the first time I've taught this student, but they asked for a reference, even though they're having trouble in my class. And they explained that over this last year and a half, they don't feel that any teacher has ever gotten to know them or tried to know who they are, or tried to push past simply their name and their number on the student sheet. And since I have conversations with my students and I approach them and I try to make them feel that they can be themselves in the classroom, that they can express themselves, he wanted to know if I would be his reference for an application, because he was going outside of the country, not just outside of the province. So I said, absolutely not a problem. And then he said, one of my friends wants to ask you as well, but it's not in her culture to come up and say anything. Can you say something to the class that you're willing to give references? And that put me in an awkward position, because that's not the sort of blanket statement that I want to give to an entire class of people, because then it waters down the value of these references and the relationship that I have with these specific students. So I tried to express a way in which that student could tell their friend that they could come and talk to me about what they want to do, and it would come up organically, but that I couldn't just make a blanket statement. But then it made me realize that there are all of these individuals who, when we have them in person in pre-COVID times, we may have caught these moments. We may have had these relationships, and they may have realized that some of their cultural upbringing could be pushed past, or that this is an avenue for them to express themselves in a safe space. It was very hard for them to find that space safe in a virtual world on Teams. And I think that's something that we have to acknowledge, that is going to affect a lot of these students for the next 5 to 10 years, because of those 1.5 to 2 years that they've spent in that virtual digital environment where they don't find that point to be themselves.
Yeah. I mean, our future challenge in our classrooms is going to be that human connection piece, right? How do we reconnect? I mean, right now we have to find ways, and it sounds like you're doing it, Kareem, and I appreciate you sharing that, but we have to find ways to try to connect. And then I'm looking forward to a future sometime soon, I hope, where I can connect with real people in real rooms. I'm hoping that comes sometime soon.
Even behind masks, it's an amazing feeling to see their eyes pop open every now and then that you couldn't really see on Teams.
I love it.
A funny anecdote is been in class with other people where we wear masks all the time, and we ran into each other in the street, and I said hi, and she was like, how did you even recognize me? I'm like, I recognize your eyes, actually. Like, I could do your eyes, and I took a risk and said hi in case, maybe it wasn't you. But anyway, so it's interesting how much we're learning each other through the eyes. But we're right at 3:59, and on the note that you just left us at, Martha, we all heard your invitation to come visit you in Ottawa. So I'll remind everyone that Martha has invited us to go spend time with her in Ottawa if you're passing through. But not that we have to cut things dry here, but it's nice to honor people's time, those who need to leave at 4, just that you feel you're not abandoning halfway through a conversation, so that if you need to leave, please do. One thing I have to do with my classes, and I would love to invite people here, and it's a way of kind of acknowledging our guests today, is if as you're leaving our session, if you wanted to recognize or name something that you're walking away with that is going to stick with you from the toolkit, or an experience, or even a question or a concern, all of that is worthwhile in a webinar. So if you want to share one thing you're walking away with, that would be a lovely way. But Martha, are you tight on time? Like, do we want to see? Okay, great. So
if people want to hang around for a few minutes, I'm happy to do that.
So we'll say thank you to everyone for joining us today in this webinar. I wanted to ask Liz, I forgot to ask you, I think we didn't ask you before, but do we need to plug anything at the end of this session? We don't have, we've had a lot of seminars.
Just Jackie's, Jackie's screening. That seems like a really great thing to plug. I'd love to go.
Wonderful. So thank you. I don't know if Jackie, there's a link if you already put it, but if you want to put a link in the chat for the event, and thanking everyone for showing up and sharing in the chat and in the conversation. And we'll stick around and take maybe some more questions, or people want to share any questions or experiences as we sign up.
Thanks, Corey. I just wanted to say, because the person who does the moderating never gets thanked. So thank you, Corey. Thank you, Selma. And of course, thank you, Martha.
Oh,
this
you're
is
so
wonderful.
welcome. What a pleasure. I love this community.
And thanks, Sue,
And thank
always
you.
in the background, and Liz.
Yep.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And you mentioned that the recording is going to be available, the chat as well, I presume, for people later on. So they can have access to the wonderful resources that were shared by so many of our of the attendees. Miriam, thank you. You contributed a few links.
My pleasure.
You're like such a great, especially in the chat, you're just like,
Yeah.
love it. I always love, I get it. I'm like, ooh, make sure keep the chat open when Miriam's there.